Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days, at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring forth for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell securely. And this is the name by which it will be called: the Lord is our salvation.
And as we start the church year, this is the first Sunday of the church year, the first Sunday in Advent. This or some version of this is always on the first Sunday of Advent. From Luke this time, 21, 5 through 19. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, Jesus, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Be watchful, be wary, that you are not deceived or led astray. For many false prophets will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will say, 'The time is near, the end of days.' Do not follow them, do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, don't be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and dreadful portents and signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you, persecute you, hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance. For I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends. They will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but hear this, not a hair of your head will perish. By your patience and endurance, you will see your salvation." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
As I said, this is the beginning of the church year. What a way to start the year, right? It's just sort of strange, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't sound like very good news. But it is, if we read this widely and deeply, we will see that actually it is very good news. Jesus is actually reassuring us that at the end of time, all of us will see salvation and not one hair of our heads will perish. And I'm going to kind of dig into this, but he's giving us a glimpse of the future. I was reading a speech by Dr. Martin Luther King where he paraphrased an abolitionist from the 1850s where he said, have any of you all heard this? I'm sure most of you have. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Meaning, a whole lot of bad stuff happened, continues to happen, and will continue to happen. But over the long haul, at the end, there's positivity, there's light, there's life. And so Jesus is giving us a glimpse into the future. When we hear this most often preached, unfortunately, and I think this is the first reading of the Christian year because clergy are supposed to use this to reassure the people, but usually it's not. We don't hear it that way, do it? It's more God's going to get you. God's angry. Look at all these horrible things that are going to happen to you and to us collectively. And it's because people don't understand apocalyptic literature. Apocalypsis means basically an unveiling. And it was popular literature around the time of Jesus, and it's when a deity, in this case, God, is revealing what's going to happen at the end of times. And Jesus is basically saying a lot of stuff is going to happen, but at the end, everything is going to be just fine. Can I get one more slide? Marty gave me a Christmas present early. And I opened the box. This is an interior diagram of a nuclear reactor. This is about what the instructions look like. Can I get one more, Kate? It's a weight set. Well, I could have used a glimpse of what this was going to look like in the future. When you all know that I'm Bob Vila, right? I told you I can barely saw like a broomstick in half. This is the parts box, and this is just one of about 6. And it was accompanied by those directions. What's my next slide? Is it sort of a big box? Yeah.
It's the whole thing.
Okay. So when I opened it, I had to say, oh honey, what a nice early Christmas gift. But inside I was dying. I just thought, oh my God, there's no way that I'm ever going to be able to do this. But as you can see, if you'll give me my next slide, I did it. Marta had to do most of it. No, I helped. But I don't know if I'm making a connection here. I sure could have used this reassurance that at the end, this was going to look like this. When back up one, Kate, when this is what I was seeing. I think this is kind of, well, you can put it back on the wayside. I think this is kind of what Jesus is doing here. He's saying, look, let me tell you what's going on. And so let's just kind of go through this. When he talks about, they're talking about the temple. If you were a Jew, the seat of your culture, of your religion, everything was in the temple. It was this giant building that Herod had completed. And it was deemed to be impregnable. God himself lives in the temple. The temple can't be destroyed. God lives in the Holy of Holies. And Jesus says, not one stone will be left upon another. It's almost like he's preparing them for what's coming ahead. And that is what happened. And then he says, beware of false teachers that will try to tell you when the end times are coming. I think it was about 3 minutes and 12 seconds after Russia invaded parts of Ukraine that televangelist preachers were on the television saying, this is it. Here's the end of times. And there's going to be this counterattack arc down straight at Jerusalem. We always seem to have this clergy thing of trying to predict the end times. And Jesus actually calls these people false prophets and evil. It's the first thing that he says, do not go after them. When you think of today, do we have wars and insurrections? What about famines? We had any plagues or pandemics recently? On a corporate level, as a people, as a culture, in our history as human beings, I think Jesus is just saying, listen, don't be afraid when these things happen. This stuff is gonna happen. It happened in World War II when Europe was torn apart. It happened during the Black Plague. It happens all the time. And Jesus is just saying this is part of life. This is part of what it means to be a human being. All these things are going to happen, but that long arc is towards light. Can I get one more? What about personally? Has anybody ever seen this statue before? Nobody? So it's in Switzerland. I think that's Lake. Is it Lausanne? I'm not sure. But it's called grief. What about personally what Jesus says here? You may be arrested. What about John Hartman last week said, thank God for, dysfunctional families? Ever had a family member turn against you? Ever been betrayed by a cousin or maybe even a mother or father or child? Ever suffered the grief of losing a spouse, God forbid, a child, someone that you loved so much that it seems like the world is a different place and will never return to normal? Jesus also says, don't worry about it, because this is going to happen. This is going to happen. What's this thing about testify, too? I think what Jesus is saying is, until you've had something happen to you to bring you to this, you don't have a testimony. You really don't, at a deep level, have anything worth saying. And that may sound cruel or harsh, but I think it's why older folks will pinch the cheek of a young seminarian who's their new associate pastor at age 27 and say, isn't she cute or isn't he cute? Because you try to have words of wisdom to pass along to people who are older and wiser and who have been brought to this and made it through that. Because that is where wisdom comes from. And you don't have to prepare a word or a defense. You don't have to think in advance, what am I going to say? Because what you say out of the depths of that will be genuine. And no one will be able to contradict it, because it is your truth and not someone else's. This will give you an opportunity to testify. When these things happen, and they will, you will have the truth, and your words will be genuine. Let's start to wrap up here about this good news. Can I get one more? I think what Jesus is saying, it reminds me of the episode in Mark. You remember when Jesus, they're out on the Sea of Galilee, and the disciples are rowing, and this huge storm comes up, and the waves are huge, and the wind is blowing, and they're rowing as hard as they can. And what is Jesus doing? He's asleep. He's in the back, as Mark describes it, in the stern with his head on a cushion. And they finally jump up and say, are you kidding? You're asleep. Don't you care that we are perishing? And Jesus stands up and calms the wind and calms the waves. And he turns to them and says something pretty, maybe pretty crummy, but pretty indicting. He says, where's your faith? I directly equate it to this, and I think as I wrap up here, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it leads to light, and it leads to life, and it ultimately leads to salvation. And what Jesus is telling us here on the beginning of our church year is that for everything there is a season. Time to plant, a time to reap, sow, reap. There's a time for death and a time for life. There's a time for joy and there's a time for weeping. And we're to expect all of these things corporately in our world and in our own lives. And there's nothing unusual or anything to be afraid of. Because in the end, not one of your hairs of your head will perish. And at the end, salvation is there waiting for all of us who patiently endure. Amen.